When you're drafting your fantasy leagues for 2022 fantasy football, making the wrong choice can be equally as harmful as making the right choice is beneficial for your roster for the entire course of a season. So today we're going to be talking through 5 players that I have as must-avoids for 2022 fantasy football based off of their draft prices, their situations, and just a culmination of factors that makes them an undesirable asset at their current draft price. If you guys are new around here, make sure to drop down, click that subscribe button, and turn the bell on so you're never late for an episode. My name is Gavin, and I'm posting fantasy football content 5 days a week here on YouTube, 7 days a week on YouTube Shorts, Instagram, TikTok, across all my platforms. I've got stuff coming out every single day. You guys, if you want to get a hold of me on the weekends, can join my community Discord server. The invite link to that is in the description of today's video. You can ask myself questions. You can ask our community questions. There's lots of opportunities for you guys to have your questions answered, your problems solved, and all kinds of great stuff this fantasy season. We do have some really exciting news before we jump into today's video. You're going to see this on, Thursday, the 7th of July is going to be the posting date for this video. But like literally 10-15 minutes ago before I'm sitting down to record this episode, Baker Mayfield has been traded for, a conditional 5th round pick in 2024. So basically what that equates to is a bag of Cheetos. The Browns just got to dump his salary and to move on, cut ties with him. This is great news though. I had DJ Moore in the video today because I was going to talk about how in order for me to just embrace DJ, in order for me to really be gung-ho on that volume and that upside, his ability to be a dominant receiver in this league, I had to see a change at the quarterback spot. Sam Darnold was not cutting it. He was not getting the job done. There were significant and serious problems with the reliability and dependability of DJ Moore and that Panthers offense with the current infrastructure they had. But Baker is no perfect player. This does not remove all of my worries and drawbacks with him for this season, but what it certainly does do is remove him from today's list because I think that his 4th round draft price is definitely, this being DJ Moore, is definitely valid and warranted now with just more steady and stable quarterback play. The bad passing numbers, the analytics will improve this season. He's got himself a very competent offensive mind at the head coaching staff spot. You've also got a nucleus of very talented skill players around him, and I think his floor is a lot higher as a quarterback than Sam Darnold's was, which will ultimately prove very beneficial for this offense. Both Baker and Matt Rule will find themselves in the hot seat still for this season, but again, it does change the fantasy implications for DJ Moore. If you want to see me talk more about this, go check out SFS on TikTok. I'll have a full breakdown there. One more quick note before we dive into our 5 players today. If you're looking for a draft guide this season, you can get a whole lot more access to these must-avoid players on my 2022 busts list with quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends all broken up into their separate position groups. We have diagrams for you guys so you can essentially hop in there, click on a player's draft profile, and then see all the information about them, evaluate their draft status. You can check out our rankings as well as our sleepers and our must-own players, but obviously the bust section of the draft guide fits in very well with today's episode, and you guys can get all of that accessed on sizzlefantasy.com. I'll leave a link in the cards, in the description of today's video, in the pinned comment section, or you guys can head over, open up a separate tab, and again, type in sizzlefantasy.com. You can get it for just under $5 a month, by far the best value in the fantasy football community right now, or you can go over to Underdog Fantasy and get access through the Super Bowl for just $10 when you deposit and use promo code SFS. I've got a link in the description of today's video for that as well, so you can get access for the entire 2022 fantasy football season, again, for just $10 on Underdog Fantasy, promo code SFS. So without further ado, stay tuned. We're jumping in. We had to toss in an emergency player in today's list who I had prepped for a future video of must-avoid players, but we're talking through him today. Let's get into it. Alrighty, here we go. Let's kick off today's video with good old Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. Now, this is a really interesting situation because we have evolving situations in both Carolina and Cleveland that we kind of have to break down the aftermath of here. And what I first want to preface this with is his ADP right now on Underdog Best Ball formats. Again, promo code SFS gets you double your money in the draft guide free, is 25.2 overall. That doesn't sound so bad. However, the context we must put behind this ADP is the fact that in Underdog, because you're playing a best ball format and the player with the highest point total, aka the best ceiling that hits that week, is going in your lineups. Nick Chubb's ceiling is not nearly as high as some other players with pass catching and receiving work in his offense. Therefore, his draft price comes at a somewhat discounted value. In traditional season-long formats, however, where we're looking at players that you want a high floor, you want consistency, you're looking for players that on a week-to-week basis aren't going to fall off the face of the earth and totally derail your entire lineup, Nick Chubb's draft price becomes a bit higher. I was checking out some other rankings. I was looking at Fantasy Pros ECR, which is their expert consensus rankings. Basically what they do is they take anyone that is in their database or whatever, they take their rankings, they mash them all up, find the averages of those rankings, and that popped out Nick Chubb fresh out of the womb as the RB7 amongst fantasy players in half PPR scoring for this season. That is a big no-no. That is a big red flag. That is a big pass. Not a chance that I am drafting Nick Chubb as my RB7 for this season. There are plenty of players going in similar territory that are much more valuable. Obviously, the consensus is you're going to have your top 3 running backs, your JTs, your Christian McCaffreys, your Austin Ecklers, but then it gets a bit murky. You've got your DeAndre Swifts, your Najee Harrises, your Derrick Henrys, your Dalvin Cooks. All those guys fall into that next category and grouping. And based off of that ECR, Nick Chubb is lumped right in with those guys. And there is just too many red flags in the situation for me outside of a pure by-the-book, old school standard fantasy football league with you and your 65-year-old buddies. I'm not trying to call anyone out there, but those are typically the type of guys that are playing your hardcore standard league with ridiculous touchdown inflation stats where, you're maybe even scoring more than the traditional 6 points per touchdown. Besides the point, those are our brothers there that absolutely, love standard scoring and Nick Chubb type players. But when you're only getting a 51.7% of the snap share in the Cleveland offense, that in itself is a red flag. I already mentioned the fact that he is really not involved whatsoever in the passing game when Kareem Hunt is healthy. You've got the fact that number right there proves to you he is not a workhorse because, again, he is sharing opportunities and pieces of that beautiful Cleveland Browns rushing pie with his fellow teammates. And you've got a guy who is and by the way, that 51.7% snap share percentage is just 27th in the National Football League. So you're talking about if you've got 12 players as your RB1 in a 12-team format with, 12 teams, that's how you get your RB1s. Your next 12 being your RB2s, so 13 through 24, that puts Nick Chubb in the RB3 category, for players in terms of snap share allotted, the amount of time he's on the field. So take out a coin, reach in your pocket, get out, your old George Washington quarter here, and flip that baby. Because, half the time it's going to be heads, half the time it's going to be tails. And just like that, basically Kevin Stefanski's over there on the sideline doing the same thing, flipping that coin with Nick Chubb, deciding if he wants him out there or Kareem Hunt or one of the other running backs between Demetric Felton, Jerome Ford. They brought back Dearness Johnson, who had a nice stretch of games when players were out with COVID and whatnot last year. It just becomes a situation where there's some barriers to entry here. There's a limitation on Nick Chubb's ceiling, and there's other guys, even a Javonte Williams or a Saquon Barkley, who have similar ADPs in best ball right now. I would rather be taking those guys every single time. Now, Saquon's a bit of a different story. His ADP is surging because I think the community is finally catching up to the upside he brings to the table this year. But for a guy who was second in rushing yards last year, you need him to do astronomical things in terms of efficiency. And when I say second in rushing, there's probably a camp of people out there that are like, yeah, number 2 on the leaderboard, let's go. Well, let's put some context behind that, because number 2 in rushing was also 600 yards behind first in rushing, which was Jonathan Taylor, who had 1,800 yards, which was about 200 less than what Derrick Henry did the season prior. And Chubb probably would have been third in rushing had Derrick actually played the whole season. So you've got all that. He had a whopping 174 receiving yards this season. That ranked 47th amongst running backs, so it goes back to that non-factor role in the receiving game. And I'd actually argue that Chubb had more of a receiving involvement this year because of Hunt's absence from the lineup at times. And he was just 18th in red zone touches this season. He had 5 goal line carries. Kareem Hunt played fewer games and had 4. That's too much of an even split there. That is too much touchdown vulturing for my taste. I had Chubb on fantasy teams last season, and I was about ready to throw my freaking remote through the TV when he would get subbed out after having a 20-yard carry, and they would bring in Hunt to finish the deal off there. and score 6 points for that offense. So Chubb's someone I'm staying away from. I'm sorry. Any sort of PPR format, there are better values, more upside to be had. Again, I understand in a traditional season-long format where consistency has a higher value placed upon it, that he becomes a more opportunistic player to have. But I still think there are better options to direct yourself towards. Pat Mahomes, we talked through him probably a month or so ago at this point in a previous must-fade player, do not draft list. I don't know what I'm going to end up calling today's video, but it might end up being something along the lines of 5 overvalued players. I'm not sure. Patrick Mahomes here at his 47.2 ADP puts him as a 4th-round quarterback. We cannot continue to be delusional and convince ourselves that he is going to be the same fantasy production, okay, that was absolutely brutal. We can't pretend that he's going to be the same player in terms of his level of weekly fantasy output. There we go, good job. That he was pre-Tyreek Hill departure. I mean, we are still so locked in on what he did in 2018, where he had 50 touchdowns, won league MVP, was the runaway QB1 in fantasy football, that now we can't see past that player. He finished as the QB4 in 2021, which, to be honest, I'm shocked and surprised that he got that far. It just didn't feel like the ceiling was nearly the same as it had been in years past. Now, the floor is very nice, which is what I think ultimately carried him to the finish line at the end of the day. But I just don't see a way to improve upon that. His ADP right now has him as the QB2. At times, especially in best ball, Justin Herbert's going above him as the QB2, which would push Mahomes back to being the QB3. But even such, why are we drafting a player who finished as the QB4 the season prior, and again, really has no way that you can figure logically that he improves this season? I'm sorry, but Tyreek Hill is one of the best wide receivers of the last decade. He is almost irreplaceable. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Juju Smith-Schuster, and Sky Moore are 3 nice players, but they are not a Hall of Famer, which is arguably, to some, what Tyreek Hill, the cheetah, represented for that offense. So I think it's going to be a struggle here. I think it's a terrible value. I think that there are too many other good options, essentially. I would rather overdraft a Travis Etienne based off his ADP, pull the trigger on a Breece Hall, address that running back position before you get into that RB dead zone. Do something. Get a high upside wide receiver. Go draft Jerry Jeudy in the 4th round. I don't care. Do not draft Patrick Mahomes. I'm sorry. It drives me nuts. And whenever someone drafts him, when I'm in a league, I'm, praising my lucky stars here because someone just fell into my lap because they overdrafted a quarterback who is not going to return the same draft value that you invested into him. You guys can come back here and tell me I'm a fool and tell me I'm an idiot if he somehow finishes as a top 3 fantasy QB this season, but I don't see that being the case with how much other upside we have at the position. And even so, the draft value, significantly better. Drafted Jalen Hurts, a Kyler Murray, guys 2 to 3 rounds later. Now, probably not 3 rounds later, but still, Jalen Hurts can be scooped up. Same for Kyler Murray in the late 5th rounds. That gives you about a round, or at times in the middle of the 6th round. There's too much other positional value to be had here. Also, I'd rather have Tom Brady or Matthew Stafford, who give you equally high passing ceilings, I think, with much better passing targets in their offenses at much discounted draft prices. Those guys are multiple rounds after Patrick Mahomes goes out the board. So, surprise, surprise, this is where we had DJ Moore at. DJ Moore has since been revested into my draft board here. This is someone who has recouped his draft stock. I am now excited about DJ Moore. I think that we still have to manage our expectations a little bit here. It is Baker Mayfield we're talking about, but again, that floor is higher. The potential for targets is still there, and I think the quality of targets he'll be receiving is definitely better than what it was with Sam Darnold. So this is where Dobbins comes in here. He is, I actually got to flip my paper over here because I ran out of note space when I was, I've got a whole segment prepared here on DJ Moore that we no longer have to address. JK's ADP is the 56.3 overall pick on Underdog right now. Again, one more time, promo code SFS gets you double your money. Your draft guide's free. Woo! All right, you guys know that by now. JK, what I love so much about him is his upside and explosiveness as a player. Coming out of Ohio State, he was I'm just going to say it. He was my favorite prospect because of his explosive ability, because I watched him take over and entirely dominate college football games. But the offense that he's landed in Baltimore is not excessively favorable to the running back position. JK will be asked to do things very, very similarly, to Nick Chubb. And I can't sit back here. Yes, the draft price is more favorable than a Nick Chubb. You're getting him, roughly 30 picks later. But I can't have the same question marks about Nick Chubb, the same bones to pick, and the same issues with Nick Chubb, and then turn around and act like it's an entirely different story for J.K. Dobbins. This is a player who is not going to be super involved in the receiving game. This is a player who is not a workhorse. There are plenty of other backs in this offense that will have situational niche roles for this team. Go to a Gus Edwards, for example. He's a big, meaty sack of potatoes. He's going to get the ball on the goal line, punch the ball in, and score 6 points for teams. You've got guys like Tyler Beatty, who I think might come in and have a nice little, wedge in the receiving game here, catch some passes, maybe a couple weeks he's got some PPR value. So for a player like JK, who I expect to have between 16 to 17 touches, total touches per game, efficiency is going to be the entire basis upon what we're basing our upside and optimism for this year. I think he's a great player, but he's coming off an ACL injury, and I did this to myself last year. I overestimated what Saquon Barkley should be expected to do coming off an ACL. As a fellow player of great athletic status, he let us down. He didn't trust his body. There is a mental component and aspect of the recovery process that I did not account for last season. I'm here. I'll admit it. I'll take the blame for it. I'm sorry if I told you to draft Saquon last year. You did it, and it bit you in the butt. I'm not making the same mistake with J.K. Dobbins this year when I already have question marks about his role and his usage in this offense. Again, I love the player. If you plug and played him into a different NFL offense that used him a little bit differently, I love him. But there's going to be a slight feel of a running back by committee system here. It's not going to be the most aggressive committee you've seen in the world, but it will be present. And you've also got a player here, again, coming off of a devastating injury that I think we have to give him some grace for in 2022 because we don't know exactly how quick he's going to be able to flip the switch and be the guy he was pre-injury. And that injury occurred in year 2, and in year 1, he was never the full takeover workhorse of that offense. So there's a lot of unknown here. This is a lot of projection-based upside for those who like J.K. Dobbins this season. And he's another guy you'll find in the bust candidate section of the SFS draft guide on sizzlefantasy.com. Again, I hate to be this guy because I love J.K. Dobbins, the player, but there is a lot of risk associated with him this season. George Kittle. Let's flip back to the other side of the page here. This is one that, I think might be surprising to some. Personally, this has more to do with value later on the board than it does with George Kittle. Maybe there's an argument to be made that another player who I love, which is the reason that I will not touch George Kittle and will almost never touch Darren Waller in the 4th round, maybe this other player should be considered more undervalued than George Kittle is to be considered overvalued. But I still think when you look at his outlook and his situation, this is a player who was going in the 3rd round of drafts last year that I was not very fond of. A guy who I think that there are just better options on the table. It's not that George Kittle can't be a top 5 fantasy football tight end. It's that there are more valuable pieces to your team that you can address at this spot on the draft board. I think we would be foolish to pass on them. Or you can address the tight end spot later on the draft board and get equivalent value. Who is this player I'm talking about? Who is this guy that I am so, bullish on that it makes me never want to touch a Darren Waller or a George Kittle in fantasy leagues this season? Well, it's Dalton Schultz. Dalton Schultz is a guy whose ADP is roughly 20 picks lower at the 68.4 overall pick, and I think easily has a case to be made for why he could outscore both Kittle and Waller this year and give you 20 picks more value and give you potentially, if Schultz were to fall lower than his ADP, 2 picks of value in between ADPs where you can address other positions, running back, receiver, quarterback, potentially if you're grabbing a Hurts or a Murray in the 5th round. There's a lot of other opportunities to take here. George Kittle is actually someone who at times, and especially in best ball leagues, I'm seeing fall farther down the board than maybe he should because I think a lot of other people are thinking the same way. This is a player who, if you ask me, I love George Kittle. Again, this is purely fantasy football talk. I think a lot of times too many of you guys get too caught up in fandom as, just liking players. I love George Kittle. If you asked me If I had a 100% healthy player that was going to give me 17 games as an NFL GM, I'd probably pick George Kittle to be my tight end. Between blocking and receiving game involvement, he can do it all. But for fantasy football purposes, there has been, fine lines for caps in his ceiling. He has never had more than 6 touchdowns in his NFL career. That is just a fact. This is a player that has had, at one point in time, the record for most receiving yards in a singular season at the tight end position, and he's never went over 6 touchdowns. He's not a super big red zone weapon. He's honestly more of a red zone blocking threat to bowl someone over to score a rushing touchdown than he is to go up and jump over someone and catch a ball in the end zone for a score. This is also a player who is, he's never played 16 games since the 2018 season, so I hate to do this, but for a guy who is going to have some missed games almost guaranteed to be factored into a situation, it's something that, based off of George Kittle's play style, it's really hard for me to expect that number to get better as he continues to age and progress towards his age 30 season here. For a guy, George Kittle you could make an argument that he is the most physical player in the National Football League. Wear and tear is just going to happen on his body. This is a guy that rams himself into linebackers, defensive ends to wash players down the line of scrimmage, and will literally jump onto defensive backs and tackle them as a form of blocking. But the point being here is you're going to get missed games with George Kittle. It's going to happen, again, because of the nature of his play style, the way he plays the game of football. And again, he has not played 16 or more games since the 2018 season, which was, 4 years ago now. So you've got a receiving touchdown cap. You have to factor in at least 2 to 3 missed games this season. And you've also got a player who has a lot of uncertainty with Trey Lance's role in this offense. Trey Lance could either be a massive positive or a massive negative for George Kittle this year. And the other thing is we have to consider Brandon Ayuk's role in this offense. Where on the teeter-totter here will we see George Kittle either take the step up and assert himself, as long as Deebo Samuel, and I should preface this as well, if Deebo were to come back in this offense, this is really what my expectation is. If Deebo is shipped off or moved into a different situation, my outlook on George Kittle becomes entirely different, because when you have a clear path to being the number 1 pass catcher in your offense, I can't discount him at that point in time. However, right now, when you're still walking the fine line of, is Kittle the number 2? Is Ayuk the number 2? Who's going to really take the stranglehold of that when you're switching quarterbacks here? We know Kittle was the number 2 with Jimmy Garoppolo, but that situation could change with the quarterback change. Again, Trey Lance could be an immense positive or negative force in this offense. And again, for me, it's less of an anti-George Kittle take than it is a positive Dalton Schultz take. Why wouldn't we wait for the draft value of a player who I could easily see, again, outscoring Darren Waller and George Kittle versus a George Kittle who is going to miss games, has never scored more than 6 receiving touchdowns. If he was walking out here and scoring double-digit TDs, that's by far the easiest way to move the needle and to push your production through the roof here. Kittle was still a tight end 4 last year, and that's fine. That's great. But when you're drafting him, you want game and week winning value on a consistent basis, and his floor at times can be devastating. His ceiling is one of the best in the game, but again, 49.9, just the top of the 5th round, just starting to edge out of that 4th round here. I'm not the biggest fan of him. And then lastly here, Gabe Davis, going at basically the same pick, 49.8 overall. I'll tell you what, if you want to draft George Kittle over Gabriel Davis, I'm not going to get in a fight with you, but Gabe Davis's hype has gone way too far for me. This is a guy who is getting close to the 4th round, again, just kind of bubbling into the late 4th round of 12-team formats. This should not be happening. The hype, again, has gone way too far. This is a guy who has a lot of reason to be excited about him, and a guy who has a lot of upside, but I remember doing drafts in March, April, even May. He started out as a 7th round pick when I first started doing drafts on Sleeper this offseason, and then obviously as you move into Underdog, where again that upside and ceiling is valued a bit higher, it's getting to such a point where I just can't believe exactly how high the expectations have risen for him. We're basing our analysis and our upside of Gabe Davis almost solely off of one game. It was the 200-yard, 4-touchdown game against Kansas City. He was making KC defensive backs fall over, tip over, look silly, and hit the deck. It's cool. My jaw was dropped to the floor in amazement. It was awesome. But when you look at the collective season for Gabe Davis, he was the wide receiver 58 with a 10.9% target share. Yes, he's 6'2", 215, has awesome upside, a perfect frame. Looks like vertically he can do everything Josh Allen wants him to do, but he had just a 49.3% snap share. I just lost my marbles earlier talking about Nick Chubb and his coin flip of opportunity to actually see the football field. Gabe Davis will see a snap share improvement this year because just naturally with Beasley out of the offense and having Emmanuel Sanders departed and now really stepping into that number 2 role. But last year with those old veteran receivers, he didn't 100% beat them out and earn the majority of the snap share for this team. He couldn't even get north of 50%. The other part of the community that's so high on Gabe Davis is the ADOT community, the average depth of target community, where Gabe Davis ranked 8th in the NFL last year. That's phenomenal. It's awesome. Again, Josh Allen's going to push the ball downfield, but you have a limited sample size here. That ADOT is probably going to decline. Now, he is the number 2 option. I've seen the insane Gabe Davis cultists here that have actually said that he might surpass Stephon Diggs, which is insane to me unless Stephon were to have something terribly awful happen to him health-wise. But the point is, again, we're getting, I think, ahead of ourselves here. The value has gone too far to the point where my hopes of ever drafting him this season are now down the toilet. I don't think it's unrealistic to think that he could have a 20% target share in Buffalo's offense, a much improved snap share for this team. But he was just 88th in routes run last year. And, for a 5th round pick, a very early 5th round pick, he's an unproven commodity with a large draft capital investment required here. And again, my expectation, he's the wide receiver 2 in Buffalo at best. So I'm trying to play this a lot closer to the chest here, a lot more realistic, and be a lot more conservative with my approach to Gabe Davis. I'm all for drafting upside. I'm all for getting excited about players in great situations. I've been a proponent here on the channel of average players in great situations make fantasy championships. But when a guy, I think the late 6th round was a sweet spot for Davis, even the mid 6th round. But now that you're starting to push him into the 4th, that is too much. It's a deal breaker for me, and I'm out on the Gabe Davis market. If you were buying in Dynasty, you got him while his price was still cheap right off that game. Good for you guys. I think you're still going to get a really solid player here, but I cannot justify drafting Gabriel Davis in the same round where I can get a guy like a Breece Hall, a Travis Etienne, some of those other receivers. I'd much rather have a Jerry Jeudy, maybe even Marquise Brown in the 4th round as a guy who could absolutely kill it in weeks 1 through 6 and still have a sky-high upside every week after that. There are too many other options for me that where this draft price is headed, I would rather have. So those are my 5 players I think are being overvalued right now. Again, based off of other players' draft positions, based off of positional value or lack thereof, and obviously just your skill set for fantasy scoring purposes. All of this is based around your upside and ability to produce as a fantasy football player. So if you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure to drop down again, leave a like, click that subscribe button, turn the bell on so you're never late for an episode. Tomorrow, I'm really excited about our episode. I'm posting Najee Harris versus James Cook. It's going to be an ADP battle, our 3rd installment here on the channel. I'm hoping to do quite a bit more of those this summer. What an ADP battle is, if you're new around here or have not seen one of those content pieces before, we did CMC versus Jonathan Taylor, Jamar Chase versus Justin Jefferson. It's a deep dive into the 2 players, comparing guys at similar ADPs or draft prices, and comparing and ultimately deciding who is the better pick. And I love when you guys weigh in on that stuff as well and put stuff in the comment section to let me know what your thoughts are on that. So thank you guys so much for tuning into today's video. Of course, make sure to check out the draft guides on sizzlefantasy.com. Use promo code SFS on Underdog Fantasy for double your money, up to $100. So you put $100 in, you'll get $200 to play with in the draft guides. Again, on my website, sizzlefantasy.com, absolutely free, or just under $5 a month for the entire season. I'll set your lineups for you and answer any questions you've got for me. So thanks so much, you guys. See you later. Peace out.